And here we are again, looking back on another year worth of really good video games. Today in gameranx, we're going to talk about the top 10 games from 2005. Starting off at number 10, we have Kingdom Hearts 2, which came out a mere 3 years after the original game, which in a modern context may sound kind of insane given the gap between this and its numbered sequel, but that's a discussion for another time. Anyway, in that 3 years, the developers streamlined and fine-tuned a lot of things that were kind of annoying in the original game, and just made it a way more fun game to play when you put the two side by side. The game is still a hack and slash action RPG, but abilities are switched up. Sora now has a series of different forms he can use to increase his battle prowess after filling up his drive gauge. New context-sensitive reaction commands were added, which really helped improve the flow of combat and kept things feeling fresh, while also fixing things that players disliked in the first game, like the gummy ship segments, camera issues, and a lack of a map. The game picked up right after the event of the Game Boy Advance exclusive Chain of Memories, showing that they were up to their release and lore shenanigans even then, but with the new story and characters introduced, there were a lot of new enemy types and worlds to explore that weren't in the original. It's an overall better package than the first game in almost every single way, although I know some may disagree as far as the story goes, but when it comes to gameplay and systems, Kingdom Hearts 2 really takes the cake. It is an absolute joy to play, even going back to it now. Moving on to number 9, we have LEGO Star Wars the video game. This is actually a pretty big one. This is the first LEGO game developed by Traveler's Tales, the team that made all of the good LEGO games and still makes all the good LEGO games. Right away, Traveler's Tales started to really put their spin on it with their recognizable humor, their really fun gameplay, plus it's LEGOs and Star Wars, two of the most fun things ever. This was a solid ass game too. There were some really fun puzzles. It wasn't too hard, but wasn't too easy to the point of like coasting through it, and the gameplay was legitimately fun, and it was even better when played with a friend or a younger sibling. It was a very family-friendly game, and anyone could jump in and play it and know what was going on. And these games are still coming out. There's a new Star Wars one coming out this year, actually. And at number 8, let's just get this out of the way right now. Devil May Cry 3 is awesome. It's not only a great Devil May Cry game, but it's widely regarded as one of the best character action games ever made and shows up on countless best of the PS2 lists that came out at the end of the generation. It's great, which is also a little shocking given the not so great reviews and reception of Devil May Cry 2 just 2 years earlier. Devil May Cry 3 built on the solid foundation that was established in the original and really took it to another level. Instead of a sequel, the game went back to where it all began, showing you Dante's origins and history with his brother Virgil, which became a huge theme for the series going forward. The gameplay is where this one truly shines though. The stylish combat the series is known for is in top form here, with the ranking system rewarding you for keeping things fresh and changing up your attack styles and weapon types as you hack and slash enemies, collecting orbs, and building up your Devil Trigger for devastating attacks. The game also introduced a series of combat styles for Dante to use, which included the quick and agile Trickster style, the damage-dealing Swordmaster, the more defensive Royal Guard, time-altering Quicksilver, as well as a Doppelganger style that let a Shadow Dante fight alongside you. Pair that with the ability to switch between 2 weapons and 2 guns during combat on the fly, letting you just keep combos going and juggling enemies pretty much as long as you want it to, and it really is some of the best action you can get and still holds up to this day. Moving on to number 7, the Battlefield series has been through a lot of changes since its inception, but Battlefield 2 has kind of always been a really high bar that almost all future installments have been compared to in one form or another. Battlefield 2 was a more refined version of the concepts established in the first game, adding things like the ability to revive down teammates and really leaning into map design and keeping that more hardcore tactical shooter experience intact, while also making smart changes that encourage more tactical approaches and cooperation. When you get down to it, Battlefield 2 is the turning point where modern Battlefield games were born. The previous entries, Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield Vietnam, were awesome, we're not denying that. But so much of those earlier games ultimately devolved into players just huddling around capture points for way too long to try and get a win. Battlefield 2 got players out there and on the move with the introduction of the squad mechanic, which implemented squad leaders and mobile spawn points on those squads, which really encouraged players to break from the control points and try to dominate the map, and it ultimately changed the series for the better. Next up, at number 6, we have Shadow of the Colossus, and man, this is a very important video game, and one of the games I'd show someone when trying to explain that video games are art. It's also able to do so much with so little. I mean, the story is kind of bare bones, but there's enough there to really get you emotionally invested, and the world that you're traveling through is super minimal in design, and I think it helps the player keep their focus on the task at hand. Nothing else matters more than dealing with the Colossus. Now, that's something that isn't minimal. For one, they're huge. Fighting that first one is still etched into my brain, and they're almost puzzle-like. There's a very specific way to take them down. You can't just run in throwing your sword around. You really have to focus and figure out how to take down these giants. And they're not easy either. They aren't crazy hard, sure, but they definitely take a good amount of time and effort, and it's all tied up with the perfect bow that is the soundtrack. Everything works together to complement the other, and it's just perfect. Bluepoint did put out a remaster on PS4, and it's great, you should check it out, but the OG PS2 release also holds up very well. This is definitely, in my personal opinion, one of the most important video games of all time. Coming in at number 5, we have Call of Duty 2. This is a big one for me. This was one of my first Xbox 360 games, along with Condemned. If I remember correctly, this is the first game I actually played on the 360, and the first real HD game that I ever saw. My family had just gotten our first HD TV a few weeks prior, and man, I was blown away. Everything just looked so sharp, and it was a Call of Duty game, so of course it looked really good, and the sounds of the gunshots were so believable and real, and the campaign was such a blast, and I played it over and over again, and those snow levels, come on. Then there was the multiplayer, which was revolutionary for me, because before this, I hadn't really been crazy into multiplayer shooters. Yeah, I dabbled in Halo 2, but didn't get into it the way everyone else did. Call of Duty 2 will always be my favorite Call of Duty. I think it's definitely a special game for me. And at number 4, we have Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. First off, can we talk about how this is an Xbox game, like an OG Xbox game, and it doesn't look like it? It definitely could pass as an early 360 game, I think, especially with the lighting. Overall, it was a huge improvement for the series and made the gameplay smoother, more accessible, while still being challenging. This is where the Splinter Cell gameplay that we all know and love really laid down its foundation. From here on out, they just kept building off of this one. It also has that first rain level, which looked unreal at the time and still looks great. I don't know, I think that this is Splinter Cell in its finest form. Personally, I liked Double Agent, Blacklist is great, so is Conviction, but Chaos 3 was the last true Splinter Cell game, and I know that sounds bad, and I don't mean it to sound bad, I just think it's the most Splinter Cell game, if that makes any sense at all. And at number 3, we have God of War, the first one, and it really had it all. The overall graphics and visuals looked incredible at the time and really acted as a showcase for what the PlayStation 2 can do. On top of that, it took some of the best hack and slash action gameplay and wrapped it up in what was, at the time, a very interesting and mature story. Playing God of War just felt right. The combat was smooth, fluid, and just wrecking hordes of dudes with Kratos and his Blades of Chaos was incredibly satisfying. The puzzles were smart and intuitive and took advantage of the environments they built and served as a nice break from the combat before throwing you right back into the thick of it. There are a few games that set a tone at the start that's so good and so effective that they're able to maintain it for over a decade, and even after enacting such a drastic shift and entering a whole new setting, as was the case with 2018's God of War, but they managed to do it, and all that stuff that still holds true today was laid out in that initial framework in 2005, and it's impressive as hell. Coming down to number 2, alright, so we know Guitar Hero wasn't the first music and rhythm game out there, but it was definitely the one solely responsible for bringing that genre into the mainstream and making them a household thing. And while future iterations of the series and its competitors like Rock Band definitely did a lot more with the premise, the original Guitar Hero was a monumental release that really changed the landscape for gaming in a big way. Guitar Hero basically built on the rhythm framework of Harmonix's previous games, Frequency and Amplitude, with an almost identical note highway structure, but rather than synth and pop music, went into the world of rock and introduced the guitar controller, which really did end up changing the game. The first iteration had only 30 tracks, but they covered quite a lot of genres with music from bands like Pantera, David Bowie, Judas Priest, Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Ramones. It's a solid foundation that was supplemented by 17 bonus songs that could be unlocked with in-game money, so yeah, it was pretty cool. Like we said earlier, sure, future iterations and imitators definitely ended up doing things better, but the impact of the first Guitar Hero on games and gaming culture is undeniable, so we needed to pay its dues here. And finally, at number 1, we have Resident Evil 4, considered by many to be the best Resident Evil game. I think it might be the best newer Resident Evil game for sure, but like, come on, the first one, totally the best one. But anyway, the reason that people really like Resident Evil 4 was in a lot of the changes that it made to the Resident Evil formula. First off, the camera angle changed to behind the shoulder, and fixed camera angles were gone. They also made it way more action heavy. And probably one of the biggest changes, there weren't any zombies. Technically, yeah, there were villagers that were infected with that parasite, and most villagers in general moved slow and zombie-like, but they weren't zombies, you know what I mean? But yeah, this game reviewed very well at pretty much every outlet, and fans loved it too. The changing gameplay is probably what it was most praised for. I guess Resident Evil really did need a change up. It also went on to be called one of the greatest video games of all time, which is wild, but also awesome. Unfortunately, the next 2 mainline Resident Evil games strayed even further from what Resident Evil once was, and one was good, but one was also really not good, and deviated way too far. Before we go, we have some bonuses for you. First up, we have Nintendogs. Remember Nintendogs? It was really cool to have a real-time pet simulator in your pocket. You could interact with them with the touch of, you know, the screen and microphone, play with them with a bunch of toys, groom them, stuff like that. It was also a lot of fun and was really unique at the time, and we miss this type of weird little game that kind of like represented the entire DS era. Next, we have Jade Empire, a BioWare RPG set in a fantasy world heavily influenced by Chinese mythology. It used a morality system that was introduced previously in Knights of the Old Republic and had a really cool story and incredibly fun combat. It'd be worth mentioning based on the fact that it was BioWare's first original IP, but it being a really cool game that often gets forgotten in the greater BioWare conversation, I just want to talk about it here. Then we have Mercenaries, Playground of Destruction. This one is just good, pure open world fun, with you playing as mercenaries in a fictional conflict with North Korea. Yeah, there's a story, but honestly, at its core, it's a game just about running around and blowing stuff up, and when it comes to that, it just straight up rules. And finally, we have Star Wars Republic Commando, a first-person shooter in the Star Wars universe that takes place right at the end of Attack of the Clones and follows Delta Squad, an elite group of clone troopers on their missions through places like Kashyyyk, Geonosis, and the like. It's a really cool concept, and despite being short, has a solid story with some pretty good writing and characters that really help flesh out that era of the Star Wars canon. So yeah, we're into it. And those are the 10 best games from 2005, but we want to hear from you, so meet us down in the comments and let us know what you think. As I'm sure you already know, hitting that like button really helps us out. And if you're new here, subscribing is a good idea because we put out videos like this every single day. As always, thank you for stopping by and hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.